Thank you. So we'll, as I said, we'll go through this introduction to some of the themes of the course, and hopefully that'll situate us somewhat as we head into the class. So a couple of things to start off with. I personally I like to schematize things in my mind, maybe overly so for a humanities prof. So to begin with, we have basically three key terms. So it'd be, in my mind, it would be to take the schematic approach, would be to kind of isolate those terms and define them and see if we can come up with some sort of visual representation in our minds of how they're related. So we'll try to think about that today. We'll talk about how to study the great books in general. So we'll talk about how we're going to study these books, but this is, you know, for what it's worth, kind of some tips on studying the great books in general outside of this course. So it's my hope that many of you will, throughout your lives, whether you're studying, you know, biology or engineering, will have some sort of interest in studying great books in any case, whether it's part of an academic study or not. And we'll talk a bit about why and how people do that. We'll talk about the role of narrative. You can see in the top right figure that I have there that narrative kind of cuts across our key terms. So we'll have narrative as kind of this guiding thread for all of those themes. And then we'll talk about, let's say, themes of the course, or ways in which we're going to be able to spot these very abstract themes of time and history in the works we're studying. Because time, as we'll see when we go through defining time, it's very abstract and very difficult to put a finger on how to define it. So let's start there. Let's start with time. So, you know, obviously it's part of our lived experience that is happening, you know, below our conscious attention all the time. You know, and as I indicated here in the slide, you know, we have a lot of expressions because of it about that indicate this lived experience with time. You know, time is sometimes feels like it's flying. Sometimes we feel like we're out of time. Sometimes we feel like we need to grab and manage and hold our time, you know, and as I say here, you know, sometimes, you know, I'm yelling at my little boys there, it's time to clean up your room, you little ingrates. But what is time? We don't, I'm going to cut, I'll save you the suspense. We're not going to get to a very good definition here, but looking at some of the limits of the current definitions is useful. So St. Augustine, so he was writing at the end of the 4th century of the Common Era, so about 1600 years ago. He said, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know." So time is one of those things that it seems obvious. You know, well, yeah, of course, I understand time. And then so we'll define it. And then, well, I'm not sure I can define it, but I know what it means. Like we have a let's say a pre-theoretical understanding of it. We understand it, we live it, we're in it, but we can't come to, let's say, this theoretical definition. So it's an elusive and difficult question. Theoretical definitions have failed since the beginnings of philosophic and scientific thinking because they're often tautological. So that means they have to use what they're trying to define in the definition. So they have to use temporal concepts to define it. They also often operate by reducing it to space. You know, it's the movement along a continuum or those kind of things. So those are limits to often of the definitions. And scientific definitions often describe the phenomena, but don't give us a definition. So we know in the 20th century, we're blessed with the insights of, you know, a genius such as Einstein that comes along and points out the relativity of time and space, and that you know, that points out that different observers can disagree on when two events occurred, but they'd both be right because it'd be relative to each motion. And then in this general theory of relativity, it's space and time as this kind of complex complex geometry that is itself relative. Again, you know, it doesn't define time, but it explains a very important phenomena about time. And then another, let's say another aspect of current scientific thinking about time has to do with the second law of thermodynamics and time's arrow. That so the second law of thermodynamics that many of you understand probably much better than I do, but you know, it's that things in the cosmos tend towards increased entropy or disorganized state, unless, you know, it's a closed system with that is being pumped with energy, so to speak. So given that point of departure, Arthur Eddington, here pictured on the right, posited a certain directionality to time, that time has to always flow in the direction dictated by that second law of thermodynamics. So we live in a universe, in other words, where we see an egg falling to the ground and cracking. We don't see a universe where cracked eggs suddenly organize themselves and into a whole egg. Okay, that as I said, is part of the directionality of the second law of thermodynamics, but it's also then the directionality of time. Okay, from past to future will always follow that sequence of from more to less organized states, according to this observation and this law. Again, an observation about an aspect of time, or let's say a phenomena of time, but not a definition of what is time. So philosophers have gotten us really no further in terms of trying to, even though the philosophers invented the what is question, you know, but they really haven't gotten us any closer to kind of satisfactory definitions of time. So Aristotle had one of the early definitions of time, and basically he saw it as this counting or measuring of motion. Okay, so I'll read this passage there. For time is just this, the number of a motion. So think of number there as the measure of a motion. The number of a motion with respect to the prior and the posterior. So time is not a motion, but a motion has time as the number of it. A sign of this is the following: we judge the greater and the less by a number, and we judge a motion as being greater or less by time. So let's say a motion is a greater motion if it took longer time in terms of its duration. So a couple of things to note there. Remember, I indicated that a lot of times time is reduced to a certain dimension, is kind of made spatialized, so to speak. So you see that in Aristotle's thinking of time, it's an aspect of motions through space, let's say. And the other thing I'll just point out that is in philosophical thinking about time, there's kind of two poles of the thinking about, let's say, the locus or the space that time is happening. Okay, so one, and this is indicated by Aristotle, is that it's out there, it's in nature, it's in the world. Okay, so for him, time is happening, it's in events out there. The other pole of thinking that we'll see with Augustine, it's an aspect of the soul. So how does that work? So Augustine, he's writing quite a bit later than Aristotle. I didn't mention the dates of Aristotle, but so Aristotle is around the mid 4th century before the Common Era, BCE. So about 700-800 years later, we have St. Augustine, who I've already mentioned. So Augustine starts with a kind of an interesting discussion on time. Augustine starts from the assumption that only the present is, only the present exists, okay? So something in the future doesn't exist yet, so it is nothing, okay? Something in the past no longer exists, it's nothing. So it does not exist anymore, okay? So only the present exists, truly exists. But the present can be infinitely divided. So is the present today? So is the present this day? Well, the present of the day can be divided into 12 hours that's already passed and 12 hours that's to come. So that's gotten us no further. Is it the present minute? You know where this is going, perhaps. You know, well, the present minute is 30 seconds that are past and 30 seconds that are future, and that can be infinitely divided. So the present is also at the end of the analysis nothing, potentially. Okay, so his final solution for Augustine is to say that what time really is this operation of the soul, the psyche, in creating a synthesis of sorts between a past that's made present in the mind, a future that's anticipated and made present in the mind, and the present that is held together in the mind. So it's this three-way direction of the soul or mind that creates time. So again, for Aristotle, the locus of time is in the world, nature, and then for Augustine, it's this operation of the mind that's synthesizing past, present, and future. So when I think about Augustine's theory of time, I think about a melody, okay? So a melody consists of these individual notes. Now, if you just took the present note, you know, like whatever note it is, I'm not a musician, so I'm not going to play anything for you here. But so if you take that note without any bringing together, any anticipation of the notes to come, and without any memory of the ones that came before us, all you'd have is that moment of the note, okay? So too in our temporal lived experience, we wouldn't really experience time, we wouldn't really have time unless there was this kind of a retention and an anticipation, like the function of the soul within a melody, to see the unity of the notes that went behind it and the ones that are to come. So I won't read the quote. I think I've kind of paraphrased what he said there. So again, to summarize what I said before, you know, we've got theoretical definitions of time that don't really get us there. They describe phenomena of time. Philosophical definitions of time have the same limitations. They don't really get us to what time is, but yet there we are. You know, it's a lived experience that, you know, we can't deny, and that we can't deny it's extremely important to us. And so I think part of the idea in the course will be to see in what ways will literary expressions of time be ways in which the phenomena of time can come to light for us in a new way, so to speak, as opposed to these definitions of time which don't quite hit the mark. Concepts of time have a history. That's one thing should keep in mind in the course. So modern humanity has moved from a thinking about time, let's say pre-modern thinking about time, that was really ruled by the cosmic cycles. So if you're living in any other age than and this happens successively, but anything before the Industrial Revolution, probably much closer to knowing when harvest season is, what the stars are, the position of the stars are telling you about what is the right time for the harvest. You probably have a much better sense of how much daylight you're going to have tomorrow. So your time is really ruled by those cosmic cycles of the seasons, of the day, those types of things. And more so now, we think of time as, it's something that's measured mechanically by clocks. We have the clock speeds of our computer, and we can make them faster. We can try to think of time as something that can be managed, so to speak. So there's been an evolution in our thinking about time, both in our ways of measuring it. So we've gone from not measuring it at all to using a sundial, which again is dependent on the sun, to other mechanical forms that are not reliant on the cosmos at all. So that's an interaction with time that's quite different in the modern age. Not necessarily better or worse. Like, in a lot of ways, it's better, right? Like we rule our lives, we control our lives a lot better. In some ways, we've kind of obviously lost touch with certain elements of a natural understanding of time. This other concept I want to raise your attention to is a concept that comes from cognitive psychology about a mental timeline. So not only do concepts of time have a history, so modern European, modern Western notions of time are different than pre-modern civilizations, but also they're culturally specific, and partly that depends on writing. Okay, so the directionality of writing. So what's a mental timeline? A mental timeline is the conception we have in our mind of the direction or the flow from past, present to future of events. So let me give you an example. If I tell you to arrange, in cognitive psychologists, this is one of the case studies they'll do. This one of the experiments they'll do with their subjects is to ask different cohorts to arrange pictures or events from oldest to most recent. And overwhelmingly, for modern Western subjects, we do that left to right. Okay, so and for that reason, you'll see, in any graph that's showing temporal data, the arrow is always going from left to right in terms of the temporal when time's placed on the x-axis there. That seems to be tied, as I mentioned, to the directionality of our writing. So because our words and our writing are from left to right, it would make sense then to for us to think about events going from past to future from left to right. So Hebrew speakers in these studies will often do the opposite. So the events go from past to future, right to left. Bilingual speakers, so the study I think is the second study I cite at the bottom there. They looked at Chinese speakers, so bilingual speakers, Chinese English. And when they were taking English words and names and arranging them, they did it left to right. So in accordance with kind of English writing, left to right. And then when they were thinking about events with Chinese names, they were doing it up and down. Like, so the flow was in accordance with the Chinese script in that study. So those are all examples where the mental timeline, the MTL, was determined by that culture's writing. So, but some cultures obviously don't have writing. So a study of the mental timeline, so to speak, of Indigenous groups in Australia showed that they arranged events from past to future according to cardinal directions, east-west. So there it's not in. There, the directionality is not in reference to where one is viewing. So all those left to right is always centered on the viewing human subject, but east-west will always be the same direction. So it's a mental timeline that's not fixated on the human subject. So again, an interesting aspect of, let's say, our experience of time, a different, let's say, a scientific observation about the phenomena of time, but it doesn't help us define time. But it's an interesting finding with respect to different cultures' experience of times. Um, so as I said, I think we'll try to see whether literature or different literary expressions can reveal different aspects about time and why. I think in some ways literature has a pretty privileged relationship to time. So of artworks, it's one of those artworks that is temporal in a number of ways. So let's say sculpture, or so plastic arts, painting, what have you. There's not necessarily a temporal flow with respect to the work itself. So whereas in literature, the stories themselves unfold over time. And also it takes time to read it. Whereas like a sculpture, you can assume, or a painting, I've kind of seen it all in one view. And the picture, although there could be a story in the background of the picture, is really showing us a snapshot, a slice of that story, so to speak. So as I said, you know, the reading of a novel takes time, okay? And maybe, you know, that's why I've tried to keep your reading list manageable for your busy workload this term. But also what they're representing are stories that unfold in time. So what do I mean by the story? And we'll need to distinguish that from the next highlighted word there, narrative. Okay, so in some people, often those two words are synonymous, and they're often used interchangeably, even by our literary critics. But we're going to need to be really careful here. So story in the technical use of the word, there's actually a field of this. It's actually a field of this. This is how specialized university disciplines are there are. But there's a field called narratology, so the study of narratives. Okay, so in that field, if we were to follow that their guidance there, a story is the unfolding of the events as told. Okay, the narrative is the actual telling. Okay, so let me give you an example, and we'll see the difference in time. Okay, so a really drastic example would be if I were to tell you a story about a man who married a young woman, and they were married when they were 20. They were very happy. They had, you know, I don't know, whatever. They have 5 kids, I don't know. And they both worked very hard all their lives. They eventually retired. They grew old together to a ripe age of 85, and they died the same day of old age, very peacefully together. Okay, so I just kind of invented that story. So that story, the time unfolded in the story was 65 years, right? So they married when they were 20, they died when they're 85, so there's 65-year story there. And you know, it wasn't an exciting story. It probably won't get Hollywood rights or anything to that story, but that was a story with a broad coverage in terms of time. The actual narrative, the narrative time, the telling time was maybe 30 seconds or a minute maybe. So that's a good way of thinking, let's say, about the distinction between narrative time and story time. Now, what can happen with narrative too is, especially as we'll see with the epic, is that the chronological flow of the story, like the story will flow naturally chronologically from the man and the woman being 20 to growing older and retiring and dying. But I could have started with the story in the middle of things, as epics do, you know? So the narrative ordering of events would be different there. The story order of events are always the same. The story order of events follow natural chronology. But my narrative telling could say, one day in the middle of his career, so-and-so looked back at his previous 20 years of work. And when he had started his adult life so many years ago, when he was 20, he had just gotten married. They were so happy. And so it starts in this crisis when he's in his, his middle career, flashes back, and then, the story could proceed forward and flash forward to the to his eventual death or whatever that I told in the other story. So story time, narrative time, and it's in that level of narrative that we're going to see those types of reordering of events and prophecy that we'll see in epics, flashbacks we'll see in those epics that go from the kind of the midpoint of the story and fill in the past and future for us. So even, again, to try to sum up here, so even if we can't come to a theoretical definition of time, literary works and the way people tell stories and narrate stories about their experience of time is one way that well, we all try to shape or communicate or come to a common understanding of our experience of living through time, and it can manifest itself in coming of age, different stories around the meaning of coming of age. So a lot of cultures seem to have those stories, and they make that a meaningful moment in life. So that's a way in which kind of the temporality of human existence is marked off and brought into bright relief by making that as a key turning point. How we meet crises, let's say that I mentioned that middle-aged adult looking back and how did I get here, and that's kind of another crisis point that you often see in stories. Again, still in Hollywood movies, there are figures such as those who have to turn to some sort of heroic act after meeting a crisis in their kind of what seems to be the midpoint of their journey in their life. And then again, societies try to define what it means to grow old and to face kind of a limit, the end in the future. So let's turn now to history and try to define what we can think about that. So in everyday usage, history, obviously relates to a dimension of time, the past. And I'll just mention, as they indicate in the slide there, that unlike, let's say, biology, which names an academic field of study, but doesn't name the object of study, history is both a name for what is studied, the object of study, as well as the discipline. So we have to be careful when we talk about it. Like people say, well, is that historical? Like, and sometimes they mean by that, like, did it happen? Like, is it the object of study? And then, but they could also say, are we taking a historical approach? I.e., are we trying to think about how that developed over time, or try to make a narrative of the causal flow that determined that course? Okay, so there it's about the approach as opposed to what actually happened, like what were the actual events, let's say, in the world. Anything can have a history, but generally speaking, we think of history as the history of a community. So, for instance, like we can have the history of computers, history of pens, but generally speaking, when we think of a historical dimension of one's place in the world, they think, okay, well, how does that fit into their culture, that culture's history, the country's history, their people's history, and kind of the shared myths. You know, there's a lot of myths that come around and people cling to as part of the history of that, let's say, community and that identity. The term history comes from Greek historia, so it's originally meant inquiry or knowledge acquired by investigation. So kind of the earliest histories, although they weren't called, he didn't use that word historia, he didn't use inquiry. But Homer's Odyssey and Iliad were in a way early heroic histories for the Greeks, okay? But what the first historians did, so the ones who used that word historia, is to try to substitute, instead of the gods as causes, can they search out other material causes, psychological causes, you know, human causes for the events in those historical, well, in both cases, wars. So Herodotus, in his description of the Persian Wars, looked for, let's say, the cultural determinants of these different peoples that led into kind of what made the Persians Persians and the Greeks Greeks. And the history of the Peloponnesian War, were there certain kind of motives behind that war outside of the gods, and what can we learn from that? Aristotle famously tried to distinguish between philosophy, literature, and history. So philosophy, poetry, and history, but poetry, let's think more broadly as literature. So Aristotle was criticizing a form of history that just looks to, let's say, empirical causes without drawing a universal. So for him, philosophy searches universal truth. So something that is timeless, something that can define, let's say, define humanity beyond individual cultural instances and beyond temporal instances, what makes human human as such. Philosophy could offer that. History, he said, could only give you particular instances. That's according to Aristotle, okay? Now he said poetry or literature in general is somewhat in between that, because it can give you instances in such a way that it reveals the universal. Like it takes particulars as a way of showing forth the universal. Like it doesn't take, it's not merely tied to the particular as particular. Now that's Aristotle. So on the other hand, the historians themselves felt what they were doing was timeless. Okay, so we have a quote here. Thucydides says, I've written, this is early on in this Peloponnesian War, I've written my work not as an essay, which is to win the applause of the moment, but as a possession for all time. So for these writers, these classical writers, all the way up to probably the dawn of probably into the 19th century, for all of them, it was assumed that what they were doing was presenting universal truths, something that was timeless, that was eternal, okay? Now, history as such, our modern understanding of history is that history is what separates us from other times, let us say. So we'll talk about a couple of waves of modernity, but in the second wave of modernity, we have this kind of rise of historicism, which posits that each historical era is defined by the thoughts, the ideas, the material circumstances of that era, and is completely incommensurable. So it can't be measured against, it can't communicate with other eras. Each historical era has its own defining features, its own values, its own notion of truth, okay? So it leads to a certain historical relativism, okay, that wherein we can't say that this is a timeless truth that so-and-so said. We know that after, since the 19th century, the claim would be, as a historian, say, well, he or she, the author of that work from back in ancient Greece, was a product of their time. So they can only say what was true at that time, and they have limited view because they don't quite see what we see over here. Taken to its conclusion, we're also clouded by our own historical moment, right? So often people forget that, but our own historical moment shelters us as well. Okay, so historical relativism is a dimension of history or historical thinking that we have to keep in mind. That is a way of thinking about history that we bring to history, but is not necessarily, if we're reading authors in the past, is not the way they thought about history. They thought they could look at events and see a universal truth in it. Okay. So I won't go through this slide, but we'll have a chance to look at this slide in other lectures, but it's a kind of a very rough outline of those waves of modernity I was talking about, and some key thinkers that are associated with those shifts in thinking. So literature, we want to define that very quickly. Literature, technically speaking, is anything written, okay? Sometimes it can be spoken material, but it's but technically and literally, it is something written. So it comes from Latin, meaning writing formed with letters. But we have to ask ourselves, what distinguishes what's studied in a literature course from a car manual. So the car manual is written, but you don't see it studied in literature courses. Well, I hope not. You never know. Maybe there's some radical schools happening in the States I don't know about right now. But I haven't seen it happen. I haven't seen it happen that car manuals are studied. So what distinguishes it? Well, often people will say that there has to be a creative dimension to the literature as studied. And this goes back to a certain Greek notion of where our word for poetry comes from, and poesis, which is making, creating. So there's maybe certain validity to that. What I would say, let's say to broaden this notion of creativity, maybe what I would say, one way to think about literature would be to think of it as a linguistic usage by which meaningful possibilities of a world are articulated for the first time. So, and we'll talk about that as a definition. We'll try to flesh that out a bit more. But in defining it that way, I'm building on a Russian formalist, Viktor Shklovsky, who coined this term, defamiliarization, for the function of literature. So often we go through our day-to-day lives, things become obvious, and because they're obvious, they fade into the background of that. They're not present to us. So if you're going to the bus, you're walking by, you're walking down the street, you don't even notice the sidewalk, you don't notice what's happening there. You don't notice anymore, let us say, people that have passed you, these types of things, because it's become a routinized, it's very routine process that you do every morning, let's say. And then if all of a sudden you see in a work of poetry, or let's say a film. Let's say a film is a really poignant scene about this. So I think film can do this too. Like film takes over a lot of these artistic functions that were theorized for earlier genres, so literary genres or artistic genres. So let's say a really poignant scene about getting on the bus, somebody, like the way it was shot or the way the actor moved, made you think about that action in a new way, right? So too is that defamiliarized it for you. So before it was so familiar, it was banal, and didn't even appear on your radar of your consciousness. But then it was defamiliarized for you. So too that can happen. It's one way of thinking about what can happen with literature. So let's oppose that to ordinary language. So ordinary language is a communication and an exchange of meanings and values, where the meanings that are exchanged are already predefined, okay? And they're already delineated and formed, okay? So I might say in ordinary language or everyday discourse, I might say, I have been hurt by intimate relationships in the past. I'm just using an example here. This is not a cry for help, or anything like that. So it's just an example about how love is described in poetry versus ordinary language. So in ordinary language, say, I've been hurt by intimate relationships in the past. So when someone says that, we take for granted that we know what hurt means, what relationships mean, all those terms. Like, we're not asked to think outside the box on those things, We're just, okay, take me at face value that you and I know what relationships mean and don't think about it anymore. Let that be transparent. Let that word be transparent and familiar, so to speak. In literary discourse, we might say, someone might say, a poet might say, use a metaphor and say something like, love is a red, red rose. Its blossoms die early, but its thorns linger. Okay, so there, through the metaphor, so that love is being compared to this rose, right? So love is a rose. So that comparison, that metaphor, draws together for the first time, maybe, for someone. Although, love's often, it's kind of a poetic cliche now, it's not that new, but when it was first articulated poetically, maybe it was real shocking. So for the first time, someone said, oh yeah, I never thought of it that way. Love, like the rose, is painful. It has thorns, and it has a beautiful blossom that is rich and is kind of the point of the whole thing. But you can't separate it from the pain. It's part of it, and often the thorns are there longer than the blossom. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so in that metaphor, the experience of that someone having been hurt in relationships before, as the ordinary discourse quote from before, let's say, is thought in a new way, is brought to light in a new way, is defamiliarized. So we've talked a little bit about what is time already. We've talked about history. We've talked about what is literature. So this is an English literature department. And so what is English literature? So it refers to the literary texts around the world written in English. So there's a nuance between British and English literature. So British is anything written in the British Isles, and it could be technically written in Welsh or other languages, Anglo-Norman. So it has a national versus linguistic focus. Our department's an English literature class, not a British literature class. Sorry, department. English studies. So like most university disciplines, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. It's dates from around the mid-19th century. Before that, people just studied books. Liberal arts studied great books, okay? And through the course of the 19th century, there are the creation of these specialized disciplines, including the national languages and literatures, and it was partly tied to European nationalistic thinking. It's again a recent phenomenon, not at all obvious as a distinction from, let's say, just having a literature department or having a liberal arts department or humanities department, not at all obvious. So English literary study came to be seen as a higher calling for religion fading in the late 19th century. It's been on a slow decline for a while, but in the late 19th century, early 20th century, people felt they could maybe teach their children the same type of values by teaching traditional works, and there was some of that thinking going on. You see here U.S. data on English degrees as as a percentage, the yellow line as a percentage. And notice that x-axis, left to right, very good mental timeline, which allows me to read it as a left to right reader. So the yellow line shows English degrees as a percentage of all degrees. And the right axis, the percents there, declining, the last few years to below 3% from a high of over 7. So people fret about that. Again, if we take a historical perspective, the English department itself is a very new phenomenon. It's not a natural phenomenon. So if it were to fade to nothingness, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Don't let anyone in the English department tell them I said that. But it's also part of a broader crisis of the humanities. So in higher education, about decline in enrollments in all those disciplines, which I think if we were to lose, more and more of those disciplines, that would be extremely unfortunate. Because it would be a way of thinking about the human experience that we know is needed, and we know, let's say, employers are asking for it. We know that people, once they've done their degrees, ask for it. So that's just kind of a historical perspective on the study within the discipline. Why write literature? So I think I'll try to stay at a really high level here, but literary traditions begin orally, as oral traditions, and the telling of stories seemingly to secure the fame of the hero or the storyteller, and to preserve ancestral values. And then the other way to think about this is in terms of the primordial importance of narrative. Okay, so narrative, as I was talking about, the way of telling a story, okay, seems to be tied intimately to our connections of self. So there seems to be, and this, again, there's an actual field of study called cognitive narratology. And this narrative theory of identity is key there. That how you think about yourself, let's say, what unites you in the picture you see of yourself as 8, when you're 8, and yourself in this moment and the intervening moments, and what you anticipate yourself doing in the short and the long term. That's part of a kind of a, not fully articulated, but very rough story of oneself that you had. Yeah, that was me when I was 8. I had a lot to learn, but I was plucky, and then I did this, and then, well, I had some challenges there, and I overcame them, and then I did this. And so those moments have been connected, even though maybe there's no real logical connection to them. Maybe even the material connections are very loose, because in the crazy flotsam and jetsam of atom soup that you're floating in, it was even in the same mix of molecules that happened when you were 8 and when you were 26. But we try to connect the events. We try to see a unity there, and narrative's key for that. So there's narrative for our own identity, and then let's say our species, as a species. So this is from a field called evolutionary literary theory. So there's evolutionary approaches to psychology, evolutionary approaches to cultural evolution as well. So why would early hominids want to adopt certain art forms? What is let's say, the adaptive advantage? How does it help the species to draw on a cave wall, to tell stories around the campfire? So according to this thinking, so this evolutionary thinking, there's the adaptive advantages might be this kind of sharing within the community, tips for whatever, tips for hunting, tips for getting ahead in the world, advantages for how to think about how to deal with one another. So part of our cultural evolution was social evolution, how to belong together in bigger groups, and that takes stories to say, How about that story of that guy who's a jerk? See how, remember that, you know, and don't do that if you want to get along with that, get this group that we all live in. So those as, let's say, functions of uh, communicating social values to a new generation. So so we have uh, these, let's say, evolutionary advantages. We have kind of cognitive advantages of telling these stories, and then literary traditions. So that's telling the stories orally, but then literary traditions, you know, writing them down and putting them into print and now in digital forms, are ways of securing those stories in more permanent forms. So that's why write literature, why study literature. I think, and I know none of you are English majors, but why would people study literature? Let's say for a course, in one course, or as a discipline, as a major. I guess the quick answers are, I guess there's the pleasure of reading. People, I still see novels being sold. I don't buy them. I'm not a big fan of the novels that they sell there, but I still see novels being sold in airports. So it happens. It happens. People are taking these and saying, "Oh, I'm going to be off for a while. I'm going to be on the plane." That's back when people traveled. I remember travel. It was really awesome. You know, maybe 10 years from now, I'm going to be telling this class and I'm going to sound like this old guy. You know, we used to travel. It was awesome. But anyway, so when people are traveling or were traveling, people would bring a novel. And so that this pleasure, academic study, another reason, but again, why for academic study? So it's not for pleasure, but the part of the academic study would be cultural understanding. So kind of window into literary expression as a window into other cultural modes of expression. And in the diverse workforce, this is something we see that employers are looking for all the time. We see that people with a humanities, social sciences background that have this understanding of other cultural forms of expression are highly sought after. Critical thinking and writing skills, again, other skills that can be honed as part of study of literature. The future of the academic literary study, I'll be quick here, just in terms of where study here is going, but there are trends that you're going to see in a lot of other disciplines as well, are increasingly interdisciplinary. So literature is now being studied across the social sciences and humanities with other disciplines to become women's studies, gender studies, critical race studies, but also with STEM fields. So in health, so you get neurohumanities. So what is going on in one's mind when one reads a book? So you've got subjects that are hooked up to electrodes. Evolutionary literary theory, I talked a bit about that. Echo criticism, so different literary modes of expression of kind of a green consciousness. Health humanities, to what extent there are therapeutic functions of reading literature. So there's quite a range of ways in which those boundaries are being crossed in the disciplines, and it's quite exciting. And then I would say the other, probably the key development. So so the first kind of interdisciplinary function is happening across all disciplines, right? So you could see this if you were studying history, if you were studying biology, whatever. I'm sure that if someone were to talk about the trends in the discipline, they'd say, well, it's increasingly interdisciplinary. Also, again, I think you can say this about all the disciplines, is that they're being advanced increasingly by large amounts of data and computational methods. So many disciplines had already been kind of on this, but humanities are somewhat latecomers on this. So digital humanities are exciting new field where we have these kind of millions of digitized texts, and through different machine learning algorithms, there are scholars out there pulling out patterns, genre patterns that wouldn't have been found before across centuries and thousands of texts. I'm going to skip over this section on how to approach the great books. It's less for this course, but it's It's more, it was more for the course of your life. So do maybe take a glance at it in terms of trying to think about how you want to read in the course of your life and what you'd want to think about that. But what's more, say more going to be pertinent for this course will be to talk quickly about narrative. Okay, so narration versus mimesis. So narration is a telling of a story as opposed to a showing. Okay, so the Greeks had these words diegesis versus mimesis. Okay, so diegesis is the telling and mimesis is the showing. Okay, so the story or plot is called the mythos. The telling, some examples there. So epic narrative poetry, novels, film in terms of camera editing and selections, etc. And then showing, you see imagistic poetry, you know, film in as much as there's just a dramatic scene that's unfolding before you, drama just in as much as there's that scene. So in each case, they're just showing you something. There's not necessarily a narration happening. Now, a story shown in mimetic representation covers the same amount of time as actual mimesis. Okay, so what does that mean? So a scene of a play that lasts 10 minutes is showing us 10 minutes of the story. So remember I told that story, I told a story, so the narration was a minute, but the story was 60 years long, okay? So there, the narration and the story had different times, okay? Time durations. So in mimesis, if I'm showing you a story in a play, okay, if I show you a scene and it's 10 minutes and it's 10 minutes of people doing stuff, the showing is 10 minutes. The story shown is 10 minutes. There's an exact equivalence of story time and the actual presentation. But in a told story, so a narrative, can be longer or shorter. Okay, so you can tell a story that my telling was shorter than the actual story told, but I could tell a story that the actual story is only a minute long, but because I told it with a lot of embellishments about what the color of the jacket so-and-so wore and what was happening in the background over there and what was happening in London, the narration lasts for hours, about a minute of time that I was telling. Now, so that example I just gave, so I won't go through this because I just kind of gave examples of that. But that example that I just gave of a narration that goes on through tangents and fragmentary descriptions of other things that ends up taking hours of narrative description to tell 1 minute of story, that's what happens a lot in these modern novels, okay? So what I'm showing you here in this slide is a interesting, I talked about one of the trends of literary analysis is to increasingly computational methods. So this researcher here, really good researcher I've corresponded with quite a bit, Ted Underwood, why literary time is measured in minutes. He charted out, well, him and his team took hundreds of works, and so they would take samples through the novel, and take that page or 250 words of narration. So 250 words of the novel is the narration, and then log how much story time was covered in that 1 page of narration, 250 words. So as you can see on the left, the early days of the novel, back in 1719, Robinson Crusoe, one of my favorites, probably the first real novel in the modern sense, in the sense of that genre. Each page took about 4 days or so, 4 or 5 days of describing the story. So in a page of description in the novel Robinson Crusoe's life, about 4 days of it would be described. As we get to the early 20th century, and Mrs. Dalloway, that's the novel we're going to read at the end of the course, we get to a point where in a page, only 6 minutes on average of the story is being described. So there's been so much condensation of the story time because, well, for a number of reasons, these are some of this is speculative, but uh, uh, a lot of the focus has gone into the interior of the mind. Okay, so it's less about action in the world, but a lot of it is focused on the associations that are happening in the mind. And we'll talk about that when we get to Mrs. Dalloway, but this is one thing to think about when we read our works from the past, and as we move forward, are we seeing different, let's say, representations of narrative time versus story time? So each narrative has time. That's the crucial element of story. You have to have time. It has to begin and end, and there has to be change, and there have to be actors and agents, and they have relationships and actions in there, and there have to be motives and reasons for that change, conflict of those agents. And then, and this is a key part of narrative, is selection and exclusion. So it can't just be kind of a data dump of every data point from your Fitbit. You know what I mean? Like, so if you took all the data from everything that's tracking your whereabouts and camera feeds, and it's giving you a lot of data points, but it's selecting the important ones, connecting them, finding causal connections. That's the next bullet there, and seeing in that motives for change and causal connections between those moments that were otherwise arbitrary. Okay. So I'll go over this quickly. It's just like characters are obviously an important part, especially in modern narratives, and we can have different dimensions of character. All told, stories have a narrator and thus a point of view from which the stories are told. Let's keep in mind the author is not the narrator. It's the narrator's point of view can be first person. So the narration can be, I went there, I did this. It can be second person. It's exceedingly rare. I've only seen this once. So second person is you. So you did, the whole story is you did this, you went there, you went there. It happens sometimes in songs, but less so in stories. Or third person. So she did this, she went to the store, she did that, she met so-and-so, conflict happened. The other thing about the narrator can be reliable, unreliable, omniscient or limited, objective or biased. To recapitulate what we've said so far, you know, so time is one way of summarize what we were talking about. Time is human time only to the extent that it's organized as a narrative. So if we think about what I was saying about oneself, one's own sense of themselves over time, it has to be organized into some sort of narrative or story of oneself. Narrative is essentially tied to time. It unfolds in time and it represents a temporal experience. And history, so in various historical epochs, different possibilities for time will be explored. And history is a narrative. So history that we think of, like that discipline of historical accounts, is a narrative of a temporal unfolding. So I'm just going to show you very quickly some of the themes that we'll want to watch out for. So as you read the Odyssey, so remember for next week, read book 11 of the Odyssey. Think about facing mortality. So these are things, these are temporal experiences, of human temporal experiences that are confronted in the epic. Mortality. So we're bound by a time, and there's an essential finitude that's contrasted with the gods in the Greeks. And what is it that gives this limited existence we have meaning? Okay. The nature of memory and how it shapes our past and present. Prophecy, so you're going to see that in the Odyssey as well as the Aeneid, and how it shapes the present and the future. The problem of the persistence of the self, what constitutes the continuity of the self from the past to the future. The distinction between the temporal and the eternal. So those are some of the themes you want to keep in mind as we go to next week's reading and the readings afterwards. Here's a representation. So often you can turn to this throughout the year. If I'll be referring to literary periods, I'll be referring to the history of ideas. So you see the literary periods at the top. So what you see at the top is literary periods that you normally hear about in the study of English literary periods. The blue and the green, that's kind of a division between two core English literature courses. If you're studying the history of English literature from the beginnings to the present, you get the first course is from the beginnings up to 1700, the blue, and then the second is the green from 1700 to the present. So that's the top, and then there's some kind of sample authors there. And then in terms of, I'll refer also to the history of ideas, and that's mapped at the bottom row there. The timeline, I won't talk about that, but again, it's there because of the need for perspective, temporal perspective, historical perspective. Okay, so that was a bit of a kind of a fire hose of information very quickly. I don't see any comments, but I'm going to open the floor for any comments or questions at this time. Okay, so I think I have a question here. Hello, sir. Are you planning on talking about the movie Tenet? It was written with no main character or motivation for the main character as an experiment. And no, I don't know that movie, but maybe Quinn, do you want to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about it if you've seen it? Are you there?
Yeah, sure. I can tell you a little bit about it.
Sure.
Basically, the idea of the movie was to write a very gripping story with no main character or motivation or anything. Like he's credited as protagonist in the credits. I don't know if there's a whole lot of analysis that can be done on it. I just thought it'd be an interesting conversation piece.
Okay, well, thanks. Yeah, I wasn't planning on talking about it, but I'll have to look at that and see. It's difficult to believe that there's no story there, but I'll have to look at that. Thank you very much. So they're consciously trying to eschew story. That was a technique of early modernist, so modernist in the sense of the early 20th century. So Luigi Pirandello has a famous play from that period called Six Characters in Search of an Author. So it's very kind of in the face of these people lost without a story on the stage. So thank you very much for that reference. I'll have to check that out.
No worries. It's a great movie as well.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. Sorry if I missed this, but what is in the final exam? Would it be an essay? Would it be multiple choice questions or short answers? So that was covered. It's at the end of the syllabus. So look at the end of the syllabus there. Helen, thank you for the question, and look at that. And if it's still not clear, let me know. Awesome movie, says Kanat. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, it's kind of. I just love the movie, so.
Tenet?
Yes. It was like very it's confusing, but at the same time you understand it when you watch the whole thing.
Okay, kinda. Okay, thank you. So Jen is asking a question. For the assignments reflecting on the readings, can we use personal pronouns? Yes, you can. Good question. I always forget to specify that, and I always get that question, so thanks. Can you repeat the movie, please? Tenet, so Tenet, I think is the movie that that Quinn got us onto. Georgia, so there's no textbook we need to purchase or anything. Good question. No, this is my gift to you. This is my gift to you. I just saved you $100. So I should have like a kickback scheme where you give me $10 each, and maybe, or something like that. This is recorded. I shouldn't have said that. No, so no, I'm painfully obvious of textbook costs, and this material is available. You're free to buy it. You know, I prefer to own the book. I'm old fashioned. I prefer to have a physical text, and I can write in the margins. So you're free to do that, but you don't have to. Okay, any other comments or questions?
Sir, I have a question.
Is that Afnan?
Yes.
Yeah,
I was
go
just
ahead.
wondering, since these are recorded, are you also going to be posting the presentation separately?
Yeah, the presentations are already up there as PDFs. Okay, so I'll post the lectures separately. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Any other comments or questions? Well, thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy reading your the Odyssey. As I said, it's not very long. I think we're in the order of 12 pages. So sit back, enjoy the story, you know, this ancient Greek story. You're not going to be grilled about it. There's no test on your knowledge of it. Just try to enjoy the story, and I'll see you back next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Take care.